Okay, welcome to this webinar. Most lawyers are depressed and anxious practicing law is actually true. I think that when I say most, maybe it's 50% or 51%, but a lot of attorneys do have issues with a lot of depression and anxiety. And this is not necessarily the most uplifting topic to present, but what it does do is it shows you the causes of that and why you're not alone. And then also, if you're not that way right now, why it can happen. And also, when you understand the reasons why, you can often control those reasons. And if you're not depressed, you might be anxious. If you're not anxious, you might be mad. People that are depressed, it actually ends up showing itself in a lot of different ways. It could also force you to quit jobs if you don't understand them, take jobs in other practice settings if you're working in a law firm. And there's really quite a bit to this topic. And it's something that I've seen firsthand a lot. And some cases are worse than others, but it's definitely something that's there as part of the profession. And I would say that every profession has its cost. Being a doctor has effects on people's happiness and things because you're seeing people die, and being an attorney has its positive and negatives. So every profession has different things that are important to understand about it. And I'm talking about this today because this is one of the things that I have seen consistently with attorneys. And I think it's important to talk about it because it affects so many people. And the final point I'll make before we start going into this is many times you have to control how you look to a law firm and when you're there. So all this depression and anxiety and other things may not come out at work, but it may be expressed when you're at home. In relationships, a lot of times I was at a firm once where I think just about every attorney was divorced. So it can create problems in your personal life, and it can also create health issues beyond the depression and anxiety. People may take drugs, they may use sex, what else? Different things that are food, things that may not necessarily benefit them because of that. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. This is not something that people typically talk about in a lot of depth, but it does affect everyone. And that's why I'm talking about it and why I think this is a very important webinar. It is how you feel inside, how you cope is very important to your success as an attorney. And that's why I'm talking about it today. I'm always working with attorneys that are looking for jobs for strange reasons. We have intake forms on BCG Attorney Search, and a lot of times these reasons aren't mentioned in the intake forms, but they end up coming out later when we talk to them personally. And certainly if you share this kind of stuff with people, they will tell you. And I remember this was hard for me to even believe, but it happened. I had an attorney that had been up most of the night working on a transaction and went home and slept in. I don't know if it's because he didn't hear his alarm or whatever, but he was 20 minutes late for a meeting with a client. And I worked with another attorney that discovered that they were disliked by a colleague in a 1,500-person law firm, and another that got tipsy at a party and was flirtatious with someone. At least that's what was reported. And the person was a partner in a major law firm. And then another case, the problem was that someone had found out too many personal details about the attorney's life. And I'm not really aware of how that happened, but these are all instances. And then each of these jobs, each of these things resulted in these people losing jobs. And the attorney that was late for a transaction, I believe was almost a second year, and he lost his job and was devastated. It was a big firm, and he had a difficult time finding a new job because he was fired so early in his career. The attorney that was disliked by someone was quitting and looking for a job because of that. It was obviously a partner, but they felt that they could never advance in their firm if this person didn't like them. And then the attorney that got tipsy at the party, that was just very strange. It was someone that it was something about he'd invited a woman into a cab, I think, after the party. And that person, I think it was like to share a cab or something, I don't know, but he did it in a way where it was taken as being flirtatious. And he was basically told that he should start looking for a job. And then the personal details, this kind of stuff happens all the time. I've seen people post things to their stories on Facebook, do blogs and things on their own and get in trouble Because of that, I think the person that posted something on their Facebook was fired. It was something about not liking the practice of law and wanted a career in some other field, and the firm saw it. These things, I believe, for the most part, are human. It's human to sleep in when you've been up all night. It's human to post your private thoughts on sites where you think you're only talking maybe to your friends or they're interested in it. It's human to ask someone to share a cab. All these things are human. And then it's human for not everyone to like you. And that's very stressful. If these sorts of things are influencing what happens, it's very bad. It doesn't matter if someone doesn't like you. In every firm, there's partners that don't like certain associates. Partners dislike other partners. And human beings, I hate to say this, and I'm not condoning very negative behavior, but human beings are essentially animals, and they take signals of someone asking your cab in a certain way. And maybe this guy had bad motives. I don't know. And then people have personal dreams and things that they keep to themselves. And that's also important to understand. If you have a personal life, there's nothing wrong with that. And you're entitled to do that. Now, if a lawyer can't do that publicly, sometimes that's the case. Some firms would care, others wouldn't. And then, of course, being late to a meeting is the same thing. The problem is that with your profession, it's very difficult, and it can lead to a lot of unhappiness because there's all these rules that people can get in trouble for. And so this webinar is really about one of the most fundamental requirements of being a lawyer that's important, that a lot of people learn in law school, but sometimes it takes a while to learn it. And a lot of times it's not even spoken about, but it's definitely true. It's about the requirement of really not showing any vulnerability or the least amount you can. And the way that most attorneys deal with this requirement, they adopt personas where they try to look infallible. And this can really cause, at least to the people around them, it can cause lots of stress, disconnection, and it leads to depression and anger and all these sorts of things. And honestly, when you're searching for a job, it's important not to be vulnerable. If you say you're being let go for your firm, that's a vulnerability, and it does hurt you. If you say different things like I wasn't getting along with people, that's a vulnerability. But these are all natural things that happen to people, but attorneys understand instinctively that they can't be honest about it or vulnerable, because if you're vulnerable, it hurts you with the firm. The other thing that's interesting is, why is this vulnerability such an important part of the legal profession? Why do lawyers take it so seriously with other lawyers? One of the reasons, I think, and I'll talk about this, I think, a little bit later, is that if you were going to court with a client and you started pointing out their vulnerabilities and not covering them up and making them look like something else, this is going to hurt you. If you do that in a transaction, it's going to hurt you. So this is really one of the main reasons. If you're an attorney at a large firm, or lots of small firms too, a lot of times it's very difficult showing weakness, and that can make you unhappy. Now, this exists, of course, at all size firms, but the most evolved and efficient firm, a way of bringing this out, is typically in large institutional law firms that grow and give people and show people why that's important. And honestly, the bigger the law firm, the more people it can hire, and the more people want to work there, and the more people want to work somewhere, the more this kind of theme is more and more pronounced at the firm. A lot of times it's interesting when new firms start, they often break off from big firms and they say, oh, we have a balance. We allow people in a subtle way to talk about how it's okay to be vulnerable. And that actually ends up attracting people. But what happens down the line is, as those firms become more institutionalized and larger and more efficient in terms of these personality traits, attorneys start having to act that way. And so if you join an upstart firm, often it becomes a much different place if it's successful, because the people, they have all these things that they do when they're new. And again, if you show weakness during an interview, it becomes incredibly hard to find new positions, because you have to look like you're in control. You're the client, and any weakness is going to be taken very seriously. And so you're your own attorney when you're interviewing, and you need to really look not vulnerable. And the higher up you are in terms of the prestige of the firm, the more likely that you're going to have that around you all the time, because not only are those firms very good at protecting their clients' interests and not making them vulnerable, they're also very good at and able to, they also expect that to run over into the attorney's life and how they portray themselves. Best attorneys are some of the most difficult people also in the world to connect with. Many times, if you see the people that are the most driven and they're difficult, we don't necessarily connect with people that have large egos or people that are very different, which egos are often needed to portray that type of invulnerability, or people that are so uptight that they're very difficult to connect with. So a lot of times it's the corporate attorneys that are similar to very sort of MBAs that are kind of in quantitative disciplines, their thought pattern. And I notice sometimes they even look like in terms of their, and then litigators, the best ones often have the largest egos and talk about their victories and stuff. And that's a form of invulnerability. And the apex of the legal profession, often the very best attorneys in the very, very best firms are often quite boring and uptight. And it's just something that I would say that you should look at closely, because you will see that even from, in some cases, the pictures on the website. So this kind of pressure to not be vulnerable, I believe, contributed to it. So this is a quick story. Years ago, I was going to take a car trip with a famous electric utility attorney. And this was a very important person, and at least in the field, but I was terrified. And that wasn't terrified because, I don't know if terrified is the right word, but I knew that this was going to be a pretty boring trip. And because attorneys like this are careful with their words, they tend to, a lot of times, judge the things you say. So you have to be careful. And they're often even cautious in their social interactions and won't open up. So I think it was a trip from Washington, D.C. to New York. And this attorney thought he was going to a conference where there were going to be some changes in the electric utility industry, and was very excited about the trip. Nothing wrong with that. But it was funny where people in the firm were excited that I was going to be, excited for me that I was going to be going with this person to D.C. And again, it was like traveling with, it wasn't fun. And again, there's nothing wrong with this, but this type of personality often comes out a lot, and often with transactional attorneys. It's not all the time. I've met a lot of very entertaining ones, but it's not always the case. And I think that's something, when you realize you have to be guarded in terms of what you say and how you say it, that is something to consider. And we went out for lunch, I remember, with some attorneys from other big firms. And it wasn't a fun lunch. Usually we're talking to each other in guarded terms. It just wasn't fun. These are just things. But sometimes you may think about the type of firm you're going to. And here, it literally would have been probably more fun taking tickets at a carnival or working in a drugstore, honestly, because it's interesting, it's fun, and that sort of thing. So it's just something to think about. All I'm saying, I'm not necessarily saying that all attorneys that are at the high legal profession are boring, because they're not. But with their colleagues and often in their work, and sometimes it rubs off to their personal life, they become very guarded and less human than they might be in terms of showing their emotions and vulnerability when they're around others at work. And that's just how it is. I think that attorneys representing the largest and most clients, they're certainly not bad people because of this. And there's certainly nothing wrong with not being exciting around your colleagues. And really the reason for this, I think, is because there's no vulnerability. So I remember hearing a story a long time ago. I think it was by Keith Ferrazzi. I don't remember. I was at some sort of seminar, and he introduced himself. And then he started saying, which person would you like better? And he said, I went to Princeton. I was one of the youngest people to make managing director at a big investment bank. By the time I was 26, I was making $1 million a year. Just all these kind of things. I went to just all this stuff that made him sound really good. He said, there's that person. And then there's the person that grew up without a father in a small town in West Virginia that worked as hard as he possibly could, then whose mother died when he was a sophomore in high school, but he did everything he could to get ahead. And so the second person is the vulnerable one. And then if you started talking about illnesses you'd overcome or other problems you had, that would be even more significant. And then you would identify with them even more. So I think when you show vulnerability, people like you better. And when people like you better, you connect more with people. And when you connect more with people, you're happy, because they have found that most of the happiness in people's lives, and I think I might have talked about this last week, but most of the happiness in people's lives comes from their connections with other people. It's not if you're rich or you win the lottery or you get a huge title, that's going to make you happy for a short period of time, but it's the connections with other people that are most important. And the only way you get those is when you're vulnerable. And being vulnerable is extremely important for your happiness and connecting with other people. So if your personality is not like that and you're unable to connect and you bring that home and it becomes who you are, the results are pretty clear. They cause relationship problems with your significant other. They may make you want to look for some other jobs and you don't know why. They may cause you to abuse substances, to do things that maybe don't benefit you as well. So this kind of thing is really a big issue. And as attorneys evolve, they often become very unhappy. And there's also been a lot of studies, and I'm not quoting them here, but this gradually starts taking place when attorneys are in law school. They start realizing that you can't be vulnerable, that you have to hoard information and that you can't share information with others. I remember when I was in law school, I was at University of Virginia, which actually had the reputation of being like a fun-loving school where people played softball and then everyone acted like they'd work hard, and even though they did, and where your personality was and getting along with others it's a real undercurrent in the school. And I think that's one reason that people do well when they come out of there, at least getting jobs in big firms. But I remember I was before an exam, or it was like maybe, I think, however many weeks there were in a quarter, it was like 3 weeks before final exams and the end of a semester. I think it was the last semester of my first year of law school. And I was in the library and I saw someone that was in my section, which was, 20 or 30 people, that was studying this outline for property. It was an incredible outline. I just couldn't believe how good it was. And because I could see he was sitting right across from me. And so I asked him if I could copy the outline. And he said no. And then I said, come on. And he said, and finally, because the person was, I guess, wasn't necessarily a friend, but he was a very good acquaintance that I saw socially. And it's not anyone I talked to on the phone or did things with alone, but it was someone I knew pretty well. And he said, well, if you want to copy it, that's fine. But you have to go out of town to do it because I don't want anybody to see you in the library. And I was like, okay, that's fine. I don't want anybody to see you in town copying it. And this is Charlottesville, Virginia. So I drove out of town to a city called Culpeper and copied it. And then when I gave it back to him, I said, I'm just curious who else had it. And he named a bunch of people in our section. And then I was curious how those people would react, because we were all in outline groups where each of us would do an outline each week based on that week's lessons. And I went up to each of those people and I asked them if they had any other outlines. And they all said no. And they said, if you let me know if you have one, I'd love to have it. And I don't think I asked every single person that had it, but I asked 3 or 4. And then I was like, wow, this is how it works. And I don't criticize the school. I'm not critical of the school. I'm not critical of the people that did it. But this sort of personality of attorneys is something that gradually evolves. It's hiding information, not helping your peers when you could, and trying to get edges over other people. And frankly, that's a very good characteristic for lawyers to have. They play it in litigation with discovery. They play it with agreements where they slip things in at the last second. They hide information. This makes good attorneys. There's nothing wrong with it. But it shows that you can't show weakness, and it's ingrained into attorneys. And so, when attorneys have other issues, they simply can't show weakness. You can't show weakness if you lose a job. If you lose a job and you're unemployed, most law firms can pick up on it, but you can't say it. And again, when a law firm is evaluating whether or not to interview and hire an attorney, you can't make the law firm aware of your weakness. You have to be in a position where you appear is if you're very competent and you understand the psychology and you're able to represent yourself very well. And that's a personality that is looked upon very favorably. And so the end result of all this is it becomes very difficult to be human around people. You have to be guarded all the time. And this can certainly make you unhappy and depressed. It's just not something that always benefits you. And if you're looking for a job, you need to portray yourself a certain way. And you have to be interested in improvement. You have to be interested in kind of covering up your vulnerabilities. And that's just how it is. And why do I say this? I say this because I watch what people do in interviews. I watch, and I'm talking about thousands of interviews. I watch the people that get jobs and the people that get even better jobs than they currently have. And that is a very good thing. I'm going to tell you a quick aside that I mention now and then, but the people that often get the best jobs are people whose resume has a history of upward mobility. So meaning you start off at a small firm, you do not get the job you want when you're in law school. And then a couple of years later, you move to a little bit better firm or a bigger firm. And then it's more prestigious. And then you get experience there and you move to an even bigger firm. Like wow, this person's on fire. They're obviously doing a good job. Everything's good. If you're trying to move to a smaller firm or a less prestigious firm, and you've done that, and that's how things are going, or you just move to the same types of firms, it's much harder to get a job because even though you're not necessarily saying you're vulnerable, you're showing that you're not necessarily on fire and your only vulnerability is you're being held back by not getting the work you want or trying to get into a better firm. So it's just something to think about. It's not something I talk about a lot, but I do think it's very helpful to understand. And the best attorneys in the best firms are often not, that they have to be very guarded, just like the law students I was talking about. And when things happen and they lose their jobs for things, it's really about not being vulnerable. It's about doing things that people can criticize that in retrospect are often not that serious or just a result of being human and those sorts of things. So that's a problem. And again, it's caused by the nature of the legal profession that expects you to represent clients in a certain way with minimizing their vulnerability. And the better the firm, the more attorneys typically understand that. And it's not necessarily that it's taught, it's that those signals are picked up based on the people that you're working with. And the people you're working with are often the best law students that understood that kind of psychology early and thrive under it. And then they learn it in the firms they go to, which are the best firms because they're the best at minimizing their clients' vulnerability. And that's what the profession's about. So you need to understand all this stuff and realize why this is happening to you. And if a lawyer wants to be successful, there's a lot of things they just can't reveal, and that it's not helpful for them to reveal. An attorney looking for jobs shouldn't be saying that they were fired. They could have been fired for a stupid reason. They could have been laid off. There's all sorts of reasons that people lose jobs. But if they talk about that often will end the conversation. It's interesting, like I've had attorneys in New York that are looking primarily at big firms. And in New York, it's a big market, and the big firms there have lots of people they can choose from. There's nothing wrong with New York. It's actually a very good legal market. But this sort of stuff is even more emphasized because there's more people that can work there. I've had people that have gone before even coming to me 6 months, a year without getting a single interview in a large firm after being laid off, actually fired. I'm thinking of one particular person. And then they went into an interview at another big firm and they got into the first office of the partner interviewing them. And the partner said, I'm going to have to cut this short because I didn't realize that you were currently unemployed. And they just sent the person out. And it's sad when this kind of stuff happens. And if they pick up in interviews that you may have been fired when they ask the reasons why and you're not given a good case, or you may be leaving your job, that's going to be difficult for them as well. If they're having a difficult time finding a job, then that's a vulnerability. I remember once, I'm not going to say the firm, but I was interviewing with a big firm in Los Angeles because I was deciding at this point whether or not I wanted to leave and the practice of law. And I think they picked up on that. And I felt like I was pretty close to getting an offer because I had a call back that went very well. And then they called me up one day, and I was in an office tower pretty close by, and they said, would you come in for a moment? And so I came in, and they put me in a conference room, and then the recruiting person, the person who was in charge of recruiting at the firm, came up and was asking me, was bonding with me personally. It was very smart. And then she asked, are you looking for a job because you're losing it? And I was like, no. And she said, are you sure? And I was like, yeah. But that was very important to that firm. And if I'd shown, and it was a very good firm, by the way, an excellent firm, but if I'd shown that vulnerability, I think they were asking that because they wanted to see if I was vulnerable. And if I was, they didn't like that. If you talk about poor performance reviews, people aren't going to like that. If you talk about not getting enough work, then they're not going to like that, because the best attorneys are always given a lot of work. I've been in firms where there's multiple people billing 2,500 hours per year, and some people billing 1,000. And the law firm, the only reason for that is they're not getting work because they're obviously are doing something wrong, and or people don't trust them. And so if you talk about you're not sure how much you want to be an attorney, if you're going to you're giving it a chance for a few more years, you're also looking at in-house jobs. If they ask you where else you're talking to or what other types of things, anything that you do is a vulnerability, and that will get you in trouble. And attorneys know this, but not all of them do. And sometimes they'll even bring up their personal life and talk about problems there. And they realize, and especially if they're serious, and they realize that's not a good idea. And these people that do this stuff in the best law firms with the most choices of people that they can hire are not interested. And it's very difficult to get a position. Even if you sue your old law firm or are in some kind of lawsuit and they find out about that, they're mad. If you have a settlement agreement, anything that reveals any sort of human struggle simply does not go over well with large law firms. And attorneys that make these kind of statements almost never get hired. Now, that's not to say there are certain firms that will hire them, and not every firm is like this, but it's pretty true. Most of them are. And that's because of the nature of the legal profession. It's not a criticism of those firms. It's because they become like that by instinctively gravitating towards minimizing their clients' weaknesses and interaction with others. And they're supposed to, and that is expected to pour over into the attorney's work. And you're really, when it comes down to it, you're expected to not have these issues, to be as perfect as possible, and not have the sorts of vulnerabilities that people in other professions are often allowed to have. And frankly, there's no other profession that I'm aware of, there's probably some, a lot, that require their members to not appear imperfect. And law firm interviews are a get acquainted affair. However, what's really going on a lot of times, I think, the interview I talked about that I was in, is the law firms are probing for weaknesses. And the better the law firm, the less intolerable those weaknesses are. They're trying to provide a good service for their clients, and they want people that are good at minimizing weaknesses. And if these weaknesses are found and they're exposed, these attorneys, pretty much everything ends, just as it would for a lot of clients if the attorney reveals their weaknesses improperly. And so you need to be aware of this. And it's important to do the best you can to connect with people and look like a good person and a good attorney, but without letting your guard down too much. And interviewers' job a lot of times is to expose weaknesses. And if the candidates do, then they're off, and they do show they're human. They're generally going to be sent packing and not get a job. This question, of course, is, do lawyers reject the lawyers who show vulnerability, or do law firms do that? And as I said earlier, yes, being a recruiter has a lot of parallels to being a good attorney, and has taught me that if an attorney shows vulnerability, they rarely get hired. And so my job as a recruiter is, I understand that. And what I'm trying to do is erase that vulnerability from their applications and make them look like they're not vulnerable. And the better I do with that, the more likely the attorney is to get a job. And unfortunately, that's how it is. And that's one of the reasons I make so many placements is I understand that, and we understand that as a company. And when we introduce candidates to firms, we do our best to not talk about any weaknesses or turn the weaknesses into a positive, meaning this person's looking for a job, not because they're laid off, not because are going to be laid off, not because they're not getting enough work, but they've outgrown their existing firm. They want to do work on behalf of larger companies in a more competitive environment. They're with those sorts of reasons. And so you put people in the position where they look stronger so they don't minimize their weaknesses while saying things that are true, not lying, but making sure that you minimize their weaknesses. And you have to look strong. What a lot of times, I was talking to a attorney the other day, and they graduated from law school in 1993 or something. And for the last, I don't know, maybe 30 years, they've had one job after another. Every 1 to 2 years, like clockwork, this person moves. And obviously, if you're a law firm and you see this, you're going to think, wow, why is this person moving all the time? And they've actually, even though they're moving all the time, they've been able to get positions in some large law firms. But a lot of times the law firms will give them titles like counsel, and then you probe and you find out they're being paid hourly, or they'll even give them a job called staff attorney. So what I did is I talked to this attorney, and like I talked to a lot of them, and I said, you basically need one heading that says between 1993 and 2002, I've worked at a variety of law firms, including this, and become an expert in this branch of law. And that actually is a way to eliminate that weakness without having to discuss 15 or 16 different jobs or 20. And that's a way to eliminate weakness. So you need to always look at your resume for the perspective of, does it show any weakness? Showing weakness is a lot of jobs. Showing weakness is jobs in other practice settings. Showing weakness is having jobs for a very short time. Showing weakness can be a lot of different things. And if you do that, it's going to hurt you, and you need to be very careful. And this is the example I gave you earlier about the attorney that couldn't get a job, that, this interview where they found out. You just have to really think about this. If you lose a job, a lot of times in major markets, if you want to work in big firms there, it's not every firm in major markets. It's certain firms, but the majority of big ones, it can hurt, when you see the best lawyers. And I've always noticed that attorneys in a lot of these big markets from big firms interview exceptionally well. Like, they walk into interviews, and it could be Los Angeles, it could be New York, it could be San Francisco, but a lot of them just very good interviewers. Like, they're amazing. And I've seen people in big firms in New York that just are able to go into interviews in any city in the country and just kill it and get every job that they apply to, because they learn how important this lack of vulnerability and how to portray themselves in a strong way. And so you need to package your resume and look at it in a way that doesn't show weakness and vulnerability. And there's a lot of ways to do that. I do resume workshops, and it's coming up time to do one. I do lots of different things to prepare attorneys to not show weakness and vulnerability. And so but on your resume, there's a lot of ways that you can show vulnerability. And it's things like, I don't know, too many jobs is one, but then not having a focus of a practice area, bouncing around, not having a focus on the practice setting you're working on, going to clerk after 5 years of legal practice, or I don't know, you get the idea, but are going and doing a job in another practice setting is a big one. But these are things that, from a law firm's perspective, show weakness and vulnerability, because what that means is you may not be committed to the law firm or working in a law firm. And unfortunately, they're going to hire people that are. And if you look vulnerable, that's something that the law firm is going to zero in and use as a reason for not hiring that attorney. One time and this is important to look at your resume and what you're portraying as well. I was in a class, and it was, I think, my freshman year of college. And I was always very interested in writing and in my grades. And I had this professor, and I kept going back because he was giving me like B pluses, and I wanted to go to law school and get the best grades I could. I kept going back and meeting with him, and he would make suggestions. And then eventually he said, the difference between a B plus paper and an A or A minus paper is you can look at it and you won't find anything wrong. The arguments are good, everything is formatted and done properly. And because of that, you get an A. And that's true. It's like that with resumes. If they can look at it and find all sorts of objections to why they should hire you, then there are things wrong with your resume that show vulnerability, which That's not good. Just like a paper or an exam that has a bunch of red on it is showing the vulnerability. It's showing a lack of understanding things. It's showing maybe bad grammar. It's showing lack of proofreading things, all those sorts of things. It's showing not thinking through arguments. And so that's what an attorney needs to do with a resume. It's very important. And you can get away a lot of times with doing this in the less prestigious law firms and that have clients that don't pay as much money. And therefore the habits of the attorney aren't as aggressive because they can't look at things in the same depth. But to work in the largest and most prestigious firms, you need to be very good at this. And any sort of vulnerability is met harshly. And it's very difficult. This infallibility, as I said earlier, applies to you. It applies to your clients. And this vulnerability is very important. And like I said earlier, it just boils down to the attorney's role as an advocate. And they're expected to take a side and not minimize their clients' weaknesses and do everything they can to make that happen. If you watch police shows or courtroom shows, you can always see how the attorneys on each side will try to turn the other attorneys' arguments into weaknesses, will not put a client that's accused of something on the stand because that will show weakness and vulnerability. There's a whole group of ideas that surround the way an attorney thinks. And that is very important. And if you show too much weakness on behalf of your clients, you're a bad attorney because people will rule against you or you get into a lot of trouble. So I was clerking for a fellow judge and we used to have a lot of bank robbery cases. And it was very funny. A bank robbery case, you would have, and there were a lot of them for whatever reason in this court, but the robber, of course, was most often caught on film, robbing a bank. If they wore a mask, you'd often see their car with a license plate. They get that from the parking lot or from them driving by 7-Elevens or whatever, or gas stations. And so and then a lot of times they would get captured within a few minutes of the robbery, which happened quite often. Then they would plead not guilty and go to trial. But what I always noticed, and I've never always stick with me, is their public defenders took their role as advocates for their clients extremely seriously. And they would do everything they can or could to get the person off. And they would make every conceivable argument and never address things like their faces on camera robbing the bank. And that's their job. The job of an attorney is to aggressively take the side of someone and try not to let any weakness come through. And because it's so important and crucial for their profession, it's only natural that an attorney is expected to be able to do this themselves. And your interview is basically a tryout of, do you understand this aspect of the legal profession? It's also probably why first-year attorneys pick it up in their courses and their interaction with other people. And the longer and more important the case of an attorney is, the more the attorney has to practice and package and portray their client to the clients in this way. And they also need to do it with opposing counsel, colleagues, judges, jurors, and anyone else they encounter in their career. In addition to that, it's with transactions, it's with everything. And so if you want to get a position, you really need to portray yourself to potential employers and everyone else as not having any vulnerability, or as least as much as possible. So now we're to the meat of this, and which won't be as much information, but this infallibility requirement really leads to attorneys having a lot of issues with depression and other things. And when you start covering up who you are, when you have to portray a different face and of yourself and walk on pins and needles, it's important that you stop being authentic. And I believe this is one reason you see so many unhappy lawyers, many times unhappy law students. When lawyers go to law school, there's all these studies that show they suddenly become, a lot of them, or majority of them, depressed and anxious and all these things. And I think it's because of this. If you can't be authentic, then what you're doing is you're closing yourself off to meaningful, true connections with others. And this is a major cause of attorney depression. It's what it is. It causes depression. And people are social. And deep in our DNA, there's a need to connect and feel connected with others. And people most often define their lives by the quality of their connections. It's the most important thing. Your connection with your parents, your spouses, your children, your friends, and significant others. And I have 2 teenage daughters, and one of them is having some issues at the moment. And I talk yesterday, and she's having some kind of issues that are psychological, I guess you would say, or I don't know, but they're fairly serious. And so I was talking to someone yesterday that has a lot of experience of driving around very wealthy people that have had, it's not my driver, that have had very serious psychological or other similar problems with their children. And this is just one of my children, but it's very scary. And his statement is that's generally because the parents, and from what he's seen over 20 years of doing this type of job, is that the people that have these problems and the children that do most often lack a really solid connection with their parents, send them to good schools and psychologists and everything to fix it, when in reality, these problems may be caused by a lack of connection with their parents. And I thought back on that, people I knew when I was growing up that were having those kind of problems. And a lot of them had parents that were lawyers and never home, doctors and were never home, business people that were never home, like CEOs and leaders of companies. And that's true. Children, just like people, they're lawyers that are grown up. When you have a lack of connection, all these problems develop. And when all these divorces with successful attorneys, there's no connection. That's the connection that may have existed before goes away. And most people's lives really do revolve around their ability to connect with others at work, socially, and elsewhere. And a lack of this makes you unhappy. It's just, how could it not? When you study human history, up until recent history, there were no cities, there were no farms, and people lived in small groups of people. I don't know what the number is. I read it sometime before, but it was 50 people or 100 people or 30 people. I don't know what the number was, but these were the average size societies, and people from that group went out and hunted and picked berries or whatever and food, and other people stayed at home and worked to raise children. But this is how most of human history is. And what's scary is the worst possible punishment that someone could receive in these societies was to be excluded from a group. So the groups would kick them out, and if the group kicked them out, they couldn't survive. And so they would often die if they couldn't even find a new group. And so this is deep, very deep within our DNA, like this need for connection with others. And you only connect to people when you're vulnerable. And so this is a major reason that people are depressed and why they're anxious, because that fundamental contact that's in your DNA, that's existed for as long as there's been humans, only up until recent history, when we started farming and that allowed cities to develop and all this stuff. But up until recent history, we were just tribes and that sort of thing. And that's what it was. So this is very important to people. It's very important just for us psychologically. And it's what our brains developed to need over hundreds of thousands of years. The lack of connection drives people crazy. When kids shoot up schools, most often I talk to someone that was some kind of specialized psychiatrist that speaks about this. He's a children's psychologist or psychiatrist, and he told me that when kids shoot up schools, it's usually because they feel excluded. They feel excluded because they're treated like outcasts because of how they dress, because of how they behave. I don't know, and so the only way that they just want to go in and kill everybody, because anybody that made them feel excluded, they do. And we're having an epidemic of people going in and shooting up schools. It's happening all the time. Adults, it's insane. Other times people will go and shoot up their former employer. They'll go into post offices and businesses, and we hear about that all the time. Why is that? It's because it's disconnection. You need connection in order to be happy. My daughter that started having all these issues went into 7th grade, and all of a sudden the social life was different there, and that wasn't good. And then she felt excluded. So people have problems and they're excluded. Think about people that commit suicide. What is that other than often not having a connection with others or feeling that you're supported, or feeling that you've done something wrong and that's going to destroy your connections and everything you relied upon. Whether Jeffrey Epstein, what happened with him, maybe he felt that he no longer, what he relied on so much was these connections to all these powerful people. That's gone. What's the option? Kill yourself. Again, this is a very big deal. Substance abuse. A lot of people use substances to connect with others. I remember I haven't drank in a long time. I quit a long time ago. But one of the things I used to enjoy about drinking is all of a sudden you have a couple of drinks and your guard's down and everyone's having fun and share. And that's a lot of times that lack of connection. Or for some people, you get a spiritual connection when you use psychedelics or certain types of drugs or alcohol, and that becomes a connection. Things like paying for sex. Why would someone do that if they felt a strong enough connection with their significant other? And religion. Religion used to be a big deal all over the country. Most people had religions, and they got connection from this. And the religion, of course, as society has become larger and larger, people's connection with religion has gone down, and people are more unhappy. People with families often have connection. People without families may lack that connection. Volunteering and helping is often considered one of the best possible things that someone can do because it gives them that connection. If you volunteer, you're suddenly in a role where you're connecting with other people. And people that do that, I've read, are much happier. But people often will, and this is something that lawyers are guilty of, will often accumulate degrees and money and cars and other things because they believe that maybe that will give them a connection to people they want to be with, or that will make them feel better because they're lacking that connection. So and maybe they get a connection when they go in to buy a car. I don't know. Homes, cars, degrees, all these are forms for some people of connection. I've seen people go to school and get 5 or 6 degrees. Maybe they enjoy being around people in school. I don't know, but it becomes a point where it's no longer necessary. And typically they talk about, and you can read studies on this, that people who are social and have lots of connections typically live the longest. And they've studied, there's an area of, I don't know what it is, but there's a city in California where everybody is a Jehovah's Witness and does stuff together all week. That's one of the places considered a blue zone where people live the longest. There's also a nursing or a retirement home or community somewhere in California where everyone gets together every night and drinks wine and has a dinner and they socialize and have all these events. And that particular nursing home or retirement community, the people there live longer than anywhere else in the United States as well. So a lot of times when you find people that live a long time, they're in environments where there's a lot of connection. People that are married and have relationships live longer. This is really important stuff and something that people should think about. And people that are depressed, of course, it's not always caused by a lack of connection. You certainly can be very connected to others, but this depression often means a lack of connection with others. And that's a big deal. So connection is unbelievably important. And you connect by having vulnerability and seeing vulnerability in others. And it can create the good in the world, and it can also create the bad. And imagine you're in a profession where this vulnerability is very difficult to have. And more of the things we do are for connection. And yet when we do these things, we're often unable to get the connection we're seeking. So buying cars, degrees, becoming important, all these things don't necessarily give you connection. And that's a problem. And attorneys are human. They want connection with others. But at the same time, the role of an attorney and what's promoted in law school and being an attorney is not to show weakness. How can you connect with others when you're not allowed to show weakness? And how can that not, if you spend the majority of your time working, not carry over into your personal life? And so this mentality actually impairs your ability to be authentic and to have authentic relationships. And you're afraid to show this weakness, and it makes you unhappy. Most good attorneys often don't let their guards down, even with their close friends, and they're good at not admitting they're wrong. They have to dig their heels in and be right with every single thing that they're doing. And you watch this with attorneys, and the second you bring up a weakness, or the second you look like you're attacking them or undermining them, they go and they respond telling you you're wrong or attacking you about some point. And this is just how it is. And a lot of attorneys, not all of them, of course, are afraid of doing anything that would make them look weak. And when I told you earlier that a firm I was at, everybody was divorced, or almost all of them, that was an extremely good firm. These were people that were from top firms and had worked in top firms, that had gone to the best law schools, that had done the best in best law schools. And that personality characteristic makes people have problems. And just coming back to that particular firm, I think it's different now, but back then there were people that eventually had very serious personality problems and other things and had problems. And I think it's caused by being a good attorney. It's not caused by the firm. So as your nature, you need to be someone who's not vulnerable. This is why attorneys are always trying to be perfect, to only find this sort of thing, to try to be perfect, is what makes them unhappy. And so attorneys suppress their true emotions and selves oftentimes much more than people in other professions. And the problem with suppressing your true self is that your connection with others is often based on someone other than who you really are. And you feel worthy of belonging and being loved only if you're not someone you like, or you're not. The whole thing of attorneys, they try to make the best salaries. They try to the highest salaries. They want to be in the best firms. They need to do things that are going to get the approval of people that are in charge of advancing them, whether it's an associate trying to be a partner, or it's a partner trying to get clients, or a partner trying to get the approval of other partners. All this is important. And so think about it. There's no other reason why all this happens and why attorneys have such high rates of substance abuse and divorce and depression. How could you not? Because it requires you to be a person you're not, and then also really has no tolerance for vulnerability. So you just end up being another unhappy lawyer. So this is how you stop it. Everyone is imperfect, and you need to realize that. And attorneys are vulnerable. And so one of the best things you can do is allow yourself to really be imperfect and vulnerable outside of work. Meaning you need to be human. You need to get that connection. You need to find it. And you need to find it often with people that aren't attorneys, or if they are attorneys, aren't probably very good attorneys, because they don't have to be that way with their peers, and they can get away from that so often. And you need to be in a position where you're running away from your nature. Now, what are things you can do? You can make religion or volunteering or a good home life, and all this stuff can be very important. A lot of religions is very interesting. Like if you're a Muslim, or I think you take Saturday off, or you're a Christian, you're supposed to take Sunday. If you're a Mormon, I think you take Sunday, and then you also have family night on Monday nights. Think about that. That's a big thing. Like where you're supposed to spend time with your family. So all these things are actually built into religions. It's very interesting, which is one reason I think a lot of them survive. There's other religions that are based on things like taking ayahuasca or whatever, and they have rituals too. It's that fourth connection. And so that sort of connection is really important to build into your life. And you need to figure out like what you can do to get that connection. Because if you don't, you're going to be unhappy. You're trying to be someone you're not. You think you should. You emulate people that are above you that have the characteristics that most often are a lot of lack of connection. And you start closing off your understanding of others. And you often cannot understand others because you're not being your own person. And when you understand others, when you can't understand others, you stop connecting with them. And when you lose that connection, you lose your ability to connect and relate to others. And this is why attorneys are depressed, and something that you can say the industry looks out for, but honestly, a lot of it is going to always be part of the depression, the legal industry. When you look at what's happening and what's happened over the past several years, attorneys are now working at home more frequently. Attorneys are more interested in work-life balance, which means what it is. It means having a balance to your life where you can connect with others. Very smart. Think about that. So everything that's happening is really about that connection. Not going to the office is about not having that vulnerability over your head when people are walking by your office and stopping by all day. It allows you, in many cases, to be happier. Although most attorneys may not realize this, the importance of being vulnerable, literally the entire legal system and large law firms in particular, because they're the best in terms of the most selective to weed out people that don't have that, make attorneys very adverse to being vulnerable. And instead of connecting with others and being their own people, unhappy lawyers will often use all of their resources and efforts to create defenses and to be people they're not do not intend to be, and what their genetic makeup makes them want to be. And so I think this is really what causes the majority of unhappiness that attorneys find in their careers. It's just everything comes down to being vulnerable. And the less vulnerable you are, the better off you are. And that psychology that you get at work in the legal profession doesn't necessarily translate into being happy at home. It's interesting, like a lot of people, when you read about presidents and people that are very successful, I remember when Obama came into office, he said that he was never going to, if he was home, not have dinner with his family. And other attorneys, like presidents, play golf all the time with people. They're always trying to get that connection. And I think that connection creates a network, and that network can help you be happy. And without a connection, people are lost, because this connection is really one of the most essential elements of being alive. That's the webinar. I'm going to take questions. I'll take a quick break, but I'm happy to answer questions about this or any other questions you have about your career. So this is a good question. So I'll start the last ones. But any questions you have, by the way, I'm happy to answer. So do you think remote work makes the mental health of a lawyer better or worse? It seems you mentioned both. Does it allow lawyers to feel better, less vulnerable by working home? It doesn't allow with the same sort of human action and connection. Yeah, I think it depends on what type of connection you have. So if you have people that are with you at home, then, that allows connection. If you feel when you go to work, you feel connected to people there, then you definitely should be in the office. I personally, when I'm not out of the office and I'm not around groups of people for an extended period of time, I do start really feeling bad and anxious and things. So I think maybe a mix is good. And it depends on the person. Some people feel that they can practice law forever if they're working at home, and others, meaning without the stress of being in the office, and others don't want that. I talked last week about the importance of people working in an office when they're working, because of the ability to have a better chance of advancement, if that's an option. And I do think that's true, but it's something for you to balance. Obviously, if you're a lot happier at home and you're able to go out after work more easily, take breaks during the day and exercise or talk to friends and things for an extended period of time, maybe that's better. So I think that's a good question. Do you recommend any innovative or unconventional approaches to address anxiety? Yes, I do. So I think one of the things I've been reading about lately, and I haven't, but I certainly haven't taken part of it, but I think there's a couple different things. One thing that a lot of people do is they do journaling. That journaling, this allows people to connect with others, to understand the causes of their nature or the causes of the issues they are facing. And I think that can help. What I've learned to do, I've learned about write about things that make me angry, what I'm sad about. Then you start off at the top and then you move into what I'm excited about, and make lists. You make lists of these things. And then when you make these lists, you've been angry about someone saying, getting a bad review, whatever it is. And you keep these lists, and that can be a really good thing. And then you write down why you're sad, why you're excited, and then what you're happy about, or things like that. And then as you do that work, you start realizing more and more what is driving your anger. Then you go back and you listen, you look at what you've done before from time to time, and you keep these lists. So the more issues you have, the better. And then where I feel connection might be one, I feel connected to others, and then where I feel unconnected might be another one. So you could write these things. So it's just these kind of subject headings to do that, and then you write that. It was funny. When I got out of law school, I saw a book in a bookstore, and it was called The Confidence Course. I think it was just a book. And at that time I was like, I need to get more self-confidence. This is important. So I read the book, and the book was written by a professor. I doubt he's so long ago. He's probably not even alive, but at Columbia College in New York. And there's also Columbia College, I think, in Chicago. So it's Columbia University. And Essentially, what the confidence course was about was interesting. It was you're just supposed to write down every day what you are mad or angry or sad about and just get all those out in the open and then come back the next day and do the same thing. And then go back every week and look at the stuff that you were mad or angry about and look at some of the past and then realize that none of that stuff is really a big deal. And then eliminating that consciousness and having a different way of looking at things is something that is really important for people. And I think that also something that can work. So that's one thing, journaling. I think that's probably the least controversial thing. I talked about religion. I talked about other sorts of stuff. I'm not going to recommend it because I don't want to get in trouble. But if you read the literature, there's a lot of people that believe psychedelics, or whether it's, I don't know what there are, there's mushrooms and others, I don't know what they are, but there's a lot of those. Ayahuasca, there's mushrooms, there's all sorts of stuff. I read something recently about someone that I think it's like a professor at Stanford, but I don't know what department or anything, but they were having all this depression and they'd taken all these antidepressants and nothing worked. And they tried all these things like ketamine, I don't know, and then they started microdosing, I think LSD, and it cured them. And so I'm not recommending any of this for anxiety and things, but I do recommend getting a perspective, however you need to do, on things that can help you be happier and connected with something, whether it's you need to do a substance to do it, whether it's a religion, whether it's whatever you do, or joining things as simple as like a book study group. That's a form of connection, or going to bar association events, I don't know, where you're meeting people from different firms. There's just lots of things you can do. Now, I'm not going to recommend everyone do psychedelics. I'm just telling you, and these aren't recommendations. That's something that people have done that works for a lot of people. I'm sure it doesn't work for a lot of others. But these are all things that can help you where that may be missing in your life. And so I think that those are good things. And then another unconventional approach is to go into a different practice setting with people that you like, to start your own firm and to try to set that up in a way that meets your interest, to find a place where there is a true work-life balance, which is difficult. But all those things, I believe, can help you and make you much happier in the long run. Okay. Are there any particular stages in a lawyer's career that are associated with higher levels of depression and anxiety? That's a good question. I think that it's almost self-selective. So for the most part, people that can't stand a lot of the stuff younger in their career, when they're younger in their career, it's very common for people to go to law school and never practice because they just get a sense of what it's like. And a lot of times when they say they don't want that life, what they're saying is they don't want that lack of connection. So people will bail out during law school. I had a funny thing happen in my section one year, in the first year of law school, where this guy was, I don't know, like 3 months in, and or a couple months in, I don't know what it was. And the professor said something like, the head of our section, he said, if you guys aren't happy here and doing this kind of work and you don't think you're going to be happy, now's the time to leave. And the guy closed his books, walked out of the classroom, and was never seen again. And I knew him. It was pretty funny. But so people leave at all different times. But I think as an associate, I think that this depression and anxiety is probably more common than it is in maybe older attorneys that have self-selected in as opposed to out. But being a partner is very stressful too, because not only are you evaluated on your work quality, but you're also evaluated on your ability to generate business and enough business and collect enough money and all that sort of thing. That can be a real difficult thing for a lot of people because you're putting yourself in a bad position there. That it just depends on the person. But I would say that a lot of people where their personality doesn't jive with that, they self-select out. And if it doesn't, then you get what you have and may not be as happy as you'd like to. Okay, so this next question is, are there any systematic changes that can be implemented within the legal profession to better support the mental health of lawyers? I don't know. I think that things are changing on their own, because if you look at this whole kind of thing that's developed over the past several years of law firms and companies and being more and more woke, meaning supporting different types of people, supporting people of different backgrounds, supporting people with different their psychologies, and trying to make people feel inclusive, of emphasizing aspects of work that were often punished. I think society doing it on its own. Obviously, some things that are very conservative will become less conservative. Some things that are very woke will probably become less woke, but there's some sort of balance that's happening in society as it is. And you have countries the UK is very similar, but certainly in other countries of the world, things are not the same as they are in the US and with socialism and things. And so I think the things seem to be moving in that direction. So I think things will change in response to society's demand. What society supports and values can change. But the big thing is, from a business standpoint, law firms really don't have a ton of incentive to change, because this psychology of an attorney is actually necessary to provide good service and to clients. And the psychology of the business side of the largest law firms requires things like lots of hours and a process of eliminating people that don't fit in with that psychology. That's just there. And I don't know how you can change that. You can put less hours in, you can give people more paternity leave and more maternity leave and time off. You can do all sorts of things. You can have part-time partner track positions, and there's just a lot to it that you can do. And law firms are doing it. And even some major law firms have been allowing people to self-select the number of hours they'll work, and then still putting them on partnership track. There are systematic changes happening that I think that are working for a lot of firms. The firms with a non-attribution model for who brings in and gets credit for clients generally have better cultures with less depression and anxiety among attorneys. Interesting. Maybe that's a good point. A lot of firms have an attribution model where anyone who's ever known the client or met with a client or talked to the potential client, gets attribution credit. So you could theoretically have talked to someone 10 or 15 years ago, and then someone else brings that client in, and the person that talked to them 10 or 15 years ago or had a relationship with them gets credit. So a lot of firms operate that way. There's what's called the lockstep method of compensation that was very common in UK firms. It does exist in some large US firms right now, but certainly not as many as you would think. And that particular model basically says that the longer you practice law, the more your salary increases. So the longer you're a partner, junior partners receive one salary, larger senior partners receive another. But if a junior partner brings in work, they don't necessarily get credit for it. That helps the firm. And so everybody cooperates. Does that create more happiness and less vulnerability? I think it may. And I don't know. I don't have anything that proves that. But the reason that can be helpful to the firm is because they don't feel the same stress as partners to compete with each other, and they can share information. And so that does break down some of that vulnerability and makes people feel that once they become a partner, they're not going to lose their job for not having business, which happens. It's very common in major firms that when somebody becomes a partner, if they don't bring in business, they often make them non-equity partner first. They either always stay a non-equity partner, they're made counsel, or they eventually are given a little runway to get business. And if they don't, they lose their job. And that can be scary. That's a form of not being vulnerable. Whereas you would have with a non-attribution model, you would probably have better cultures and less depression. Another thing that I bring up a lot on these meetings, and I just want to bring it up again, is attorneys that join firms in smaller markets where there's not a lot of attorneys, and even to some extent, when I say smaller markets, I don't know, market with 25,000, 50,000 people, but attorneys that join these sorts of firms are often have a lot more career stability at those firms. I was talking to an attorney in a market of South Carolina not too long ago, and which wasn't a huge legal market. And this attorney was telling me that they all went out to their kids all worked in the same or were in the same sports leagues and things. And they all went to this, they all had the same club that they went to, and they socialized, and there really wasn't ever any there wasn't a lot of attrition in the firm. And also the attorneys there were, I don't know, that they attended their wives socialized and all that sort of stuff. So I think that can be a real important point just to consider in terms of how that stuff works in a lot of smaller markets. And what I've noticed is if you join a firm in a smaller market and you often are there your entire career, the reason I think is because there's not a lot of options for you to move. The firms in the market all know each other and work together on a consistent basis, so they don't want to steal people from each other. They're more cooperative. And then there's a real pressure to make things work to keep the attorney there, to provide support for them where there might not be in other firms that don't have as many attorneys to choose from, or where they're just a group and they're all together. So you have more of the tribal aspect that I talked about earlier, where that may not exist in a lot of larger markets. So it's not just the larger firms, it's also the larger markets where that happens. Okay, this is another good question. Have you observed any differences in rates of depression and anxiety between lawyers working in different areas of the law? For example, litigation, corporate law, and family law. Yes, I think that's actually probably a good question. I think that a lot of this anxiety, a lot of it is in litigation or litigation-related disciplines. The reason for that is an attorney that's doing litigation has all these people trying to watch what to screw up. So if you're an attorney in a law firm, say you're an associate, your boss is going to be an associate more senior than you, then it's also going to be, and it could be several of them. Your boss will also be partners, and it could be several of them. So you may be working on 15 cases. So that's 15 different or 30 different or whatever senior associates that are your boss and watching for you to screw up. You also have your other associates you're working with that if you screw up will bring it to other people's attention. You also have the partners that are watching you, waiting for you to screw up. And then you have the court that's willing to point out the things you've done wrong if you screw up. Then you have the client who's willing to get on you if you screw up. So that's a lot of people. Think about that. That's a lot of people waiting for you to screw up. And that's very stressful. Now, that certainly exists in other practice areas. It could exist in corporate law where you have the same sort of thing, but not the court, but you also have the client. It can also exist in family law. One of the things that's interesting about family law is that can be tremendously stressful because you're really seeing the worst side of people. But at the same time, family law attorneys, a lot of what they do is connecting with their client, listening, taking counseling, and all that sort of thing. So that's actually a very nice aspect of it. And it may lead to fewer issues. I don't know. And then you have a lot of transactional practice areas, I think, that where you see less of that. Practice areas where I would say like ERISA and all these different practice areas that are more transactional in nature. Many times there's less stress, patent law, things, I don't know, but in a lot of them, sometimes there's not as much stress. I would say also as a general rule, a lot of the consumer-facing practice areas, so you have family law, you have, trust and estates, you have personal injury plaintiffs, you have even insurance defense to some extent, because you're really defending companies against people. But a lot of the consumer-facing practice areas, people really and are, I think, more happier. The reason for that is trust in the states and ERISA. Trust in states is a little bit of a different one, but a lot of the consumer-facing practice areas, because the work has to be done so quickly, because the clients aren't paying for it, aren't willing to pay, there's less emphasis on this complete vulnerability. The work quality doesn't have to be as perfect. Attorneys aren't necessarily competing with each other as much, and the firms are smaller and aren't able to, and don't have all these conditions associated with what makes you a good and bad attorney. It's just much different, and that requires less stress. And also, when you're in a consumer-facing practice area, an important thing to consider is you're pretty much working directly with a client. That's a form of connection. And so that creates a different attorney than someone that's actually removed from the work. That's even more alienating. When you're one of like several people working on behalf of a client, that can make you feel quite alienated. There's that as well. It says in-house lawyers, this is a good one, I'm trying to cut and paste this, and I'm having a little bit of a problem here. It says in-house lawyers aren't under the same sort of pressure to show them vulnerabilities. Yes, of course they are, but it depends on the company that they're working with. And you have two types of people to practice law. There are those that get ahead on the quality of their work, and then there are those who get ahead with politics and being very good at that. One of the things that's interesting about in-house stuff is in a law firm, the emphasis really is just on the quality, the amount, and how much work you're actually doing, and then to a lesser extent probably on politics, because the work is more emphasized and the hours and that sort of thing. In-house, what's interesting is that you certainly are doing work as well, but things like your ability to find good outside counsel, your ability to form a good relationship with the executive team of the firm and give them the impression you have their back, all these sorts of things are exceptionally important in an in-house position. People that are political by nature tend to do a much better job connecting with others and getting their points across in a subtle way. And I think to a great extent that is, people that go in-house, if they're good at that, are able to connect more. And I also think that people that go to in-house positions, as a general rule, are able to do politics better than they may have been in a law firm. And politics by nature is your ability to connect with and influence people. Whereas a law firm, certainly that's important, but it's more about the quality of work in most firms. Now, law firms definitely have people in them that are political. There's always going to be different executive committees and things inside of law firms. And in order to show their value, certain people will try to do that. And a lot of times the people that are doing that do not offer as much value to the firm in terms of the work, the quality, the clients, but they offer value in terms of their political ability to influence aspects of the firm and people in it. So in-house lawyers, of course, are under that. The difference between in-house lawyers and law firm lawyers is that what's expected at in-house jobs in terms of the quality of the work and in terms of the political ability is all over the map. A law firm knows what an attorney from another big firm, they know that their emphasis there is probably on the quality of their work. And so they're happy to hire other attorneys from other law firms. But when they interview people for in-house jobs that are coming from in-house, they realize that the quality of work probably was less important than the politics. And in addition to the quality of work being less than the politics, that maybe the attorney's skills have been changed from work to politics. And it's not always the case, but that's their experience with a lot of in-house lawyers that go in-house, a lot of in-house lawyers that come from law firms. And so they don't want that. I mean, bringing someone in that's very good politically doesn't always make the law firm money. And that's what they're concerned about. And they don't know what the quality of the work means at an in-house job because there's so many companies and they just don't know, whereas they know what that means when they're talking to attorneys from other law firms. These are great questions. Thank you. Let's see here. Wow. Geez, that's a great question. Let me see here. This person says, thank you for this question. I have a genteel, kind, and nice personality, which has resulted from my overcoming countless major difficulties. I've always excelled academically as well. I've used this personality to develop millions of dollars in new business because I easily connect with other people. I've also had a very successful litigation results, and I always excelled academically. What is the best way to convey this to potential employers in a short video? The best way, really, you don't need to always talk about your having overcome countless major obstacles. You can if you overcome something that is not going to make people think you're too vulnerable. It could be growing up in a difficult situation, or I don't know, but you can do that. But the big thing is if you've generated millions of dollars in business and done very well from an academic standpoint, you should talk about your academics on your resume. And then in a short interview, really what the law firms are most interested in for a partner level attorney is your business. That's usually going to be the first question they ask or try to get to. And then they're going to be interested in your billing rate and whether it's the same as theirs or similar and go there. So that is really important. Going into an interview and just saying you connect with people is something that a lot of people without business talk about. They'll say, I'm really good with, I don't know, being a sounding block for associates and things like that. And that's okay, but you have to talk about that. You can also talk about your litigation result. This is something a lot of litigators will do. They will brag about how great results they got, even in interviews, and people like that. That's not showing vulnerability. So your ability to do that is going to be very helpful. And yes, let me just see. Okay, let me just see. Okay, what steps can a lawyer take? Let me just see here. What steps can individual lawyers take to prioritize their mental health and well-being while still maintaining a successful career? Great question. So the idea is you need to have limits and you need to have personal limits. But the first thing that I talked about a little in the webinar is you need to find outlets for connection outside of your job and take them very seriously. So you need to find outlets and take those outlets very seriously. And what I mean by that is that your ability to have rituals, meaning rituals with your family, rituals with friends, rituals with religion, if you do that, all sorts of rituals that are part of your life and that are almost non-negotiable. Some people and law firms have a ritual that they're going to spend every Friday with their family or every Saturday with their family. And they don't work on Saturdays, or they have rituals where they take vacations every few months or things like that. So those rituals are very important. So if you have those rituals built in, you're often much better. Other things you can do are you can do your best to set limits at what's tolerable for you, of what is tolerable. So everything has its cost. And what I mean by everything has its cost is you may not want to work in a law firm, or you may want to work in a smaller law firm, or you may want to work in a different practice area, or you may want to work again in a different practice setting, or you might not want to practice at all. So you have to set things up in a way that works for you. And that's a very mature type of decision. Most people are operating on fear. And so a lot of people that don't leave, that are unhappy, are afraid of what else there is. And meaning they want to be able to support their family or support themselves, student loans, what else? I don't know, obligations, which would be houses and obligations and all that sort of obligations, homes, etc. So all those things are things that many times people that they're driven out of fear. So you need to put yourself in a position where you realize that maybe what I fear, I shouldn't fear. That's one reason, by the way, where I talked about earlier today, and this is you creating these kind of lists, because what you'll find is most of the things you're actually afraid of are not threats, but you have to create a list of them over time. And then you tend to move less from the position of fear into something else. You said, are there any steps that law schools can take to better prepare law students for the potential mental health challenges they may face in their careers? So the problem, like I talked to you about University of Virginia, which has a great reputation of a place that emphasizes connection as part of its DNA, which I think is true. I believe it's true. But in terms of preparing law students for better mental health challenges, I think that the problem with law schools, and it's not anything wrong with them, is they're evaluated on things like bar passage rate, or how much income the average attorney makes when they come out, which means going to big firms. And then they tend to hire people that a lot of times have the most prestigious backgrounds, may have worked at big firms, meaning they're very lawyer-like. The way kind of law schools work is as they should work based on what's emphasized, but they are moving away from that. You have things like Yale Law School, which was the first to stop reporting things to U.S. News and World Report. And then, I don't know, most of the top 10 law schools other than Chicago and Virginia followed suit. And that's a way of saying, hey, we're interested in people that aren't necessarily going to fit into this mold of being the best students and having the high LSAT scores. We want to develop a class that's more diverse, that has people with different strengths and personalities than you may find in your typical lawyer. And Therefore, we're going to create a different brand of lawyer that's not the same. So that's what's already happening. That's when you hear that's actually law schools rebelling against being expected to do and create a certain type of attorney, which is very interesting because if they all do it, then things like the bar passage rate will change across the board. Things will happen that people will go into different careers, which will affect the average starting salaries. And a lot of this stuff, will happen based on the decisions the law firms make. And this is a question. I'm not sure if I answered this already. Let me just double check. How can law firms and legal organizations create a supportive and healthy environment to mitigate the risk of depression, anxiety among lawyers? So it would just be alternative work arrangements. I think, did I talk about it? Let me just see here. I want to make sure this looks like something I may have answered. Okay, no, I didn't. Okay. So it's things like alternative work arrangements. It's allowing people to become partners with lower billable hours. It's things along those lines will help. And a lot of law firms are doing that. I was reading an article about, I believe, Nixon Peabody, and I don't know where it was, but it was in a legal publication, and they had almost an associate revolt. And I don't know if it was regarding working at home or hours or something, and I don't know if it was a revolt, but the attorneys there were saying, they interviewed a partner and they were saying, this is what people require now. So I think that these sort of alternative arrangements are important. And I think it makes firms more competitive to the extent that they have happier lawyers and less turnover. That can help. Those are things, I do feel like things are going in that direction, and will continue. I think that law firms that want to be competitive will do that. And obviously what will happen is as law firms start offering more and more of those benefits to people that may help them with depression and so forth, those law firms will get better people working there, and ultimately better attorneys that stay longer, and they'll have lower replacement costs for attorneys, and that will help them. And so I think that all this stuff that's a really good thing for law firms and will help them. Okay, I think those are all the questions. Let me just see here. There's one question here that I'll answer that doesn't repeat the other ones. So I think I've answered all the new questions. This question is, let me see, are there any unique challenges that new lawyers face? Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that new lawyers face is not understanding a lot of what I've talked about today and being ruled and controlled by things they may not understand. I think that learning to become a different person and all that sort of thing, I think is probably the most unique challenge. Okay, thank you. I appreciate everyone being on this webinar today. I think it's very important. And I'm going to try to do a resume workshop either next week or the week after that, which is always a lot of fun. And so we will send out to everyone who's on this webinar today requests for your resume and everything very shortly. So thank you.